thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on ensuring the social and environmental impact of agriculture and food innovation. This webinar is part of the side sessions that are part of the lead up to the FAO Science and Innovation Forum that's starting next week. And I think everybody here knows that technology and innovation are critical components to building more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food systems. But some of the big questions that we need to ask are, how do we make sure that the agri-food tech startups and entrepreneurs have a proper understanding of the true value and systematic implications of their solutions? And how do you measure and track it? You know, how do we make informed decisions about which technologies and innovations to invest in? So for today's discussion, I have actually a very diverse panel, from entrepreneurs to researchers to investors to sustainability experts. And I'm actually going to start with the men today because there are fewer men for once on the panel than women. So first, Didier Toubia, who's the CEO of Aleph Farms. And I'll let each panelist, when they start talking, to sort of tell a little bit more about themselves. Then we have Padraic Flood from InFarm, and he leads the crop genetics team. Kanira Shah from Astanor, investment principal. Jennifer Blanke, who is the non-executive director at ARC and also a former VP at the African Development Bank and in charge at the time of agriculture, human and social development. And last but not least, Martine van Weelden, who is the director at Capitals Coalition. So for today's sort of discussion, and really it's about how do we make sure that this nascent industry, the agri-food tech sector, is accountable for what it's delivering, and and we're keeping the sector honest, but at the same time, want to really have take two perspectives, one top down and one bottom up. So that's why we sort of have the macro perspective that I would really like to sort of kick this macro perspective off with Jennifer, and sort of get your initial thoughts of, when we think about agriculture and food, it really has very far-reaching impacts across so many areas. So do you want to sort of share your thoughts on why sustainable food, why it's so challenging to actually understand what the impact of what sustainability means in the sector, and why we have to think about it from a whole ecosystem standpoint and not sort of, unfortunately, what's happening in the agri-food tech sector sometimes of infightings between, a certain type of practice or certain types of foods or, solutions.
Great. So, I mean, I think, we've seen over the last decade or so, maybe even a little bit longer, this move from sort of a focus on agriculture to a food system perspective, specifically because we understand how important and complex it is. And that investments or, efforts in one part can have a huge impact in others. Now, I'm a development economist, and so what I often think about, of course, I care very much about the environmental impacts, but also the social impacts, right? And so, and I find actually in a lot of the discussion, and we're probably going to focus a lot on environment here, and that's normal because you can measure it more easily sometimes, but it really has an impact across the board. And so, why is it important? And again, think, if you're talking about field to fork, you're talking about a huge variety of activities, right? Whether it's like tillage, all the way up to what are you doing in your factory and getting things out and packaging. So just thinking about that is massive. You can almost not think about a sector that is so, so vast in terms of complexity level, and then if you talk even before, and that's what Didier, I think will also be thinking about is, how do you think about the science behind it as well, right? And so why is it hard? It's hard because people tend to think about their own area of focus, right? And while things are changing so quickly, right? So it's normal, any sector you go to, and it's amazing. Even if you're talking about the education, people focus on education versus nutrition versus, and so everybody's kind of looking at their thing. And yet, we have all of a sudden on top of us, these ESG kind of, metrics that are coming, particularly in the environmental space. And if you're an entrepreneur who's trying to figure out where I can make a difference, it can be quite a challenge to figure out where you fit. in this, particularly in sort of attention sometimes, particularly in technology, between productivity and sustainability. And there I'm talking about environmental and social. And so, I won't go too much into detail here because I really want to hear what everybody else has to say. But the truth of the matter is, if you think about anything, I mean, who would have thought that, just even not even a year ago, 6 months ago, that fertilizer, or that basically, geopolitical things, happening in Ukraine would suddenly change, the price, input equation for companies on the other side of the world who are trying to think about what are the latest, kind of new technologies that will make things more sustainable. And the last thing I'll just say, because I know we'll talk about this a bit more, is that if you think about, sort of solutions that matter, very often I think it's very hard for companies to figure out where things are going because they only are looking at their particular space. And I think what we need to do as a group is make sure people are talking to each other a lot more and getting the right kinds of advice so that they understand where things fit, because we almost are talking about a second mover advantage here. I mean, we really are talking about a second mover advantage here, where you're assuming that a lot of the new efforts coming in are going to be sustainable from the get-go. And so then how do you think differently about how you're going to measure that from inception on?
So building on that, maybe Martine, I know at Capitals Coalition, because you really try to take a holistic perspective and understanding, and sort of worked on building a framework to understand implications of the cross implications across many different areas. So do you want to sort of maybe talk about the work you've been doing?
Yes, it was a great segue Jennifer provided to the work that we are doing within the Capitals Coalition. So at the Capitals Coalition, we really look at decision making and integrating natural but also social and human capital into decision making, because we see that often these issues are interrelated, and especially indeed in the food system, soil health, water quality, but also workers' health, for instance, needs to be addressed in a holistic way in order to make informed decisions and to understand how that impacts and how the sector impacts and depends on these capitals. So that's really what we do within the Capitals Coalition. We have issued the Natural Capital Protocol, really looking at the natural capital only. Whereas in the project that I lead, the Toubia Agri-Food for Business project, we've been integrating these 4 capitals, also produce capital, and provided guidelines to businesses. Any agri-food business can use them in terms of how to assess and measure and value, most importantly, impacts and dependencies, and to enable businesses to understand the risks and opportunities on these capitals, and how to then, very importantly, identify the risks and opportunities that come with these capitals, and how to include those in decision making. So that's what we've been doing, and what we're currently also piloting on within the Capitals Coalition. We've been running this project across 7 countries on the globe. So 2 countries in Latin America, Mexico, and Brazil, and 5 countries, larger economies, India, China, Thailand, Malaysia, and I will always forget one, Indonesia, in Asia. And maybe one thing to add in terms of like the macroeconomic level and how it all fits together. I think, of course, there's a lot, there are many approaches and many methodologies currently in place. The Capitals approach goes a little bit beyond ESG. It doesn't just look at outputs, but also really we try to move businesses to actual application and outcomes within their decision making. And of course, within the COP15, we're calling to make it mandatory and to also use it as part of the ACT-D framework. So the assessment, commitment, transforming, and disclosure, that's really a kind of umbrella framework now where we come in to support businesses in the assessment side of the work.
And I think just picking up on something you said, and a conversation that Jennifer, we had a while in prepping for this session, was part of this need to understand the impact one of the downfalls is that we sort of forget that everything's about compromise. There is no one size fit all solution for everything. So I don't know if you want to sort of especially given the vast array of impact that areas that we're touching when we talk about agri-food tech sector.
I think, if I may, I don't know if you've seen the WWF report this morning. I haven't read it yet, but it states that there's a 69% drop in wildlife population since 1970. So that's in 50 years, less than 50 years. So I think there's no trade-off, because we won't be able to do business on a dead planet, basically. So we need to address global issues and incorporate the value in our decision making. But indeed, within the approaches, of course, I think there's many, like I said, and many do have a merit and are somewhat tailored to a different audience. But we shouldn't forget that we're very much dependent on natural capital, and we can't do without.
So maybe Kanira, I want to sort of, there's that big broader macro level, and I think we'll definitely talk again to Jennifer and Martine, especially Jennifer also, like how do governments decide where to invest and what and what solutions that we should be sort of betting on. But you're sort of in the middle here, sort of providing some of the initial funding for a lot of these startups, and you're one of the leading impact investors in Europe. How do you've had to come up with your own framework to understand how to measure impact, because somebody like Didier or Padraic can't come in right away and have followed the entire a framework that, for instance, Capitals Coalition just described when we're startups. So do you want to sort of share a little bit more on your sort of impact philosophy?
Yeah, sure. No, and thanks for having us here. So it's very much not a one size fits all, right? Each startup is so different, and our impact journey with startups that we invest in really starts from the beginning, from sourcing. So we have a dedicated impact team that kind of assesses the startup together with us. Will this be able to actually generate an impact as well as a return? Because at the end of the day, we are a VC. We do need to create a financial return for our LPs as well. So we look at impact investing kind of holistically. It's such a difficult problem as well to solve, right? Agri-food is lots of moving parts. We look at it both from ESG and impact. So on the impact side, we have 6 KPIs that we developed. And because each startup, again, is so different, we didn't see necessarily that it could just be, only GHG emissions or only biodiversity. It's like the 6. And to do a little plug here, we just have our impact report that has come out, our second one. So please do have a look and do come back with feedback. It's always a work in progress. So we looked at it from the sense of there should be like 3 planet KPIs, more on the GHG emissions, biodiversity, water use, but also 2 people KPIs, so social and health, and 1 enabler. So that's what we like to call climate intelligence. So anyone that enables this to go further, like in our portfolio, that's their best. But we also found some challenges with just doing this on a pure measurement perspective. So we're also thinking about how to model this in a better way, so where we can incorporate this across funds, across deals, because it's again so different for each startup, and also to make this model a tool for our startups to use. So say if one company wants to expand and find a supplier elsewhere, like what impact will that have on their rest of the chain, and how can you incorporate that? And it's like you said, it's a work in progress. We use like true cost accounting for that as well, with a bit of inspiration on that. But yeah, a lot of different parts that we try to quantify.
So And I think that this brings, reminds me of actually, again, a conversation, the conversation with Padraic on, the need to the true cost accounting. And I think we'll definitely get into that. But one of the, from a researcher standpoint, I'm going to ask you a point, we're talking, there's sometimes an expectation, maybe I'm wrong, but this is the way I see it, of this is, and I come from the pure, more traditional technology background where, there was always this technology is going to solve all the world problems. And, over time, we've always, technologies come about and there've been a lot of unintended consequences, good and bad. I'm not, it's not in a negative or positive. So there's a lot of companies out there, entrepreneurs out there, researchers out there trying to, working on, addressing, developing a solution. But and then also being able to sort of define and measure, and say this is the impact we're going to have, but it's the future. We don't quite know exactly. So how, as a researcher, how do you think about it? What are sort of the KPIs that you feel that you need to be putting in place today, and that you to sort of be able to track, because you can't guarantee what it's going to be like down the road.
Yeah, I'm going to keep with the big picture perspective on this particular one. Of course, the future is always uncertain, and that's what, when you do science, you try to manage that uncertainty, right? And one of the ways that you do that is you look at how things have happened in the past and what has gone wrong, what has gone right, and how can you use that to project into the future. And when thinking about food production and how to make food production and food systems more sustainable and more resilient, I think we need to think about both aspects, because if they're not resilient, but they're sustainable, well, that's no good, especially considering the kind of instabilities we can expect in our future climates. For me, the key property of food production, which in many ways separates it from any other industry that I'm aware of, is its sheer extensivity. Like the massive footprint it takes up on the planet. And this is I'd say the main driver in much of its negative environmental impacts. So if you look at the Stockholm Resilience Institute and the Planetary Boundaries Framework, we breached 5 of them. And I think agriculture is the main driver for 3. And a large extent, the reason why it's such a big driver is just because how much space it takes. So I use that as my first sort of North Star in thinking, what kind of technologies and what kind of innovations do we need to think about going forward, which will hopefully have a long-term positive impact on the sustainability and resilience of our food production systems. And one of the key conclusions of this is, how do you reduce the footprint, and how do you decouple this need for space, this ecosystem destruction, from food production? So that's the simplest metric that I can think of. And then coming back to some of what was said earlier, is that at the end of the day, though, you've always got to be careful about metrics. That's one that I think is hard to gain, because metrics will be gamed. And if you come up with a simplified metric, people will aim towards it. I come originally from academia, and famously there, people look at H indexes and publications and stuff, and then people just figure out how to not really do great science, but how to get their H index up. And that's not good for research. And you always need to think about that. How can you come up with a metric which is valuable, useful, but difficult to gain? And that's where I think certainly the big picture really helps.
So I want to sort of maybe turn to you, Didier, because you've got, so you launched Aleph Farm. You have, on one hand, the research part and the solution and technology you're developing, and then you also have the having to launch a company, decide, and you're going to go into production, and and as when Kanira was just talking about, like, what happens when suddenly you have to change suppliers and you have to go somewhere else, and so when you're trying to measure your own, you want to be an impact native company. Can you sort of walk us through your journey from like what it was like at the beginning to try to launch a company, and in addition try to make sure that it is impact native, and where were like the challenges in terms of resources, in terms of getting information, and did you have to, what were some of the compromises you have had to make along the way?
Yeah, I think that's a topic we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, really trying to maximize the impact of the company and to inform our decision-making process based on actual data and measurements of the impact of the process as we scale up and launch in the near future. Aleph Farms is one of the pioneers in the field of cultivated meat, which is about growing cells from real animals, the cells which make the meat we know today, but on the outside with much more limited resources. We just need the amount of water, land, nutrients, energy to make the steak instead of sustaining cattle in our case for 2 to 4 years. We can also help a lot with a lot of food safety and public health issues with mitigating the overuse of antibiotics in intensive farming, but also reducing the occurrence of pathogens and reducing the bacterial load in meat primarily. And there are some food security aspects of it as well, because we grow our meat a little bit same as InFarm with vegetables in a closed system, independently to the availability of local land and water and under any climate. We can decentralize meat production and make high quality food in places where it's difficult today to grow or to farm cattle or to make this food. So there are a lot of different aspects of the impact of what we do. We're working with a partner in the Netherlands on an interactive LCA, life cycle analysis. We're monitoring 18 parameters every 6 months based on our process, and we're optimizing our process, taking into account those inputs on top of other technical or yield or economic inputs. And to Martine's point before, I think that the idea here is really to see how we can switch from output to outcomes. I would argue that the food system today, following the industrialization of agriculture and food production, hasn't been designed to feed the people, but rather optimized for producing more calories and quicker, cheaper, and not necessarily to bring the right level of nutrition to anyone, anytime, anywhere when he needs it. And the proof of that is very simple, that today we throw away approximately 1/3 of our food, while close to 900 million people don't have access to enough nutrition. So there's a mismatch here, which we believe needs really a rethinking of the overall food ecosystem. And the innovation will play a critical role here, because on one hand, if we're heading toward more regenerative agriculture, more extensive, more sustainable farming practices, the efficiency of those practices will also be lower than intensive monoculture as of today. There had been some research done in Europe following the farm to fork strategy, the Blanke report, for instance. And so we need to supplement this transition toward regenerative agriculture with additional production systems which can supplement conventional farming practices and provide the right amount of food and proteins to keep up with demand while staying in balance with nature and managing all those parameters together.
But just from a pure, management standpoint, as, the CEO of a startup, most startups don't have somebody in charge of sustainability from day one.
Mm-hmm.
When, how do you just, yet part of your value proposition is about changing, being an impact native company, making sure, trying to make sure that you have all these, as you just said, you're monitoring all these different, you're trying to monitor and optimize, the way your processes. So, what if you had advice to give to, other startups, like how do you, when's the right time? And maybe, Kanira, you want to also jump in, because as from a VC standpoint, I think you might have quite a bit of a few thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'd be glad to hear your views as well. But there's a preconceived idea that the solution to the food system crisis, or in our case to the protein transition, is a technical solution. that it's enough to be able to produce, high quality proteins very efficiently to solve the ecosystem challenges, and that's not the case. I think that we need to look at the solutions for bringing to the market Aleph farms and other companies dealing with innovative food production systems in a much more holistic way. The inherent attribute of an ecosystem is that all the parts are interconnected, and especially if we're looking at the protein ecosystem, it's super complex. It involves meat, milk, leather, collagen. It has a social impact, environmental impact, economical, nutritional impact. So we really need to have a much more system-based, holistic approach from start. And this is what I would encourage entrepreneurs and other companies to implement in their thought process. For instance, with cultivated meat, we know for sure today we're significantly improving the impact of beef production versus conventional methods. I'm not sure that cultivated chicken, for instance, would necessarily improve the environmental impact of meat production versus conventional practices. So, for instance, at Aleph farms, we decided to go for beef sales and beef steaks to start with, because we're focusing on a strategy which is combining high impact and high margins to make sure that we can build a sustainable business model and to deliver the impact we're intending to bring to the world. And if we don't think about that at start and just focus on solving technical issues, I believe we're missing the point, and many companies in our space are not necessarily, bringing a real solution to anything.
Maybe to
Kanira,
jump
yeah,
in on
I'll
that,
let you.
yeah. It's really about also helping, CEOs, management teams, general teams that we invest in, helping them along their journey, because nobody can figure it out by themselves. And we have a team as well where we're involved from the beginning to help startups think, challenge them, how they can go about picking the right metrics as well, but also learning from each other. So like what we've done is also set up an impact community internally. So, the startups can talk to each other and say, hey, what are you doing? Maybe there's something that we can learn from what you're seeing. LCAs, life cycle assessments, we require that from like beyond seed, when they have a product, once it makes sense. And we also help them with, experts and really are involved quite actively, I'd say. Maybe that we should ask the startups themselves how they feel about that. But I think it's definitely necessary, because you're at the forefront. Things are new. It's not been done before. So the more help I think we can provide to startups trying to do something about this, I think the better. So at least that's how we see it.
Martine and Jennifer, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, and also, partially also from a government's, an investment or, national standpoint, when, people sort of go, oh, this is the latest trend, we have to go. I mean, I think we just saw, a country saying, oh no, are we going to go, change it, the type of, and I'm blanking out on
Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, exactly. Like, how do you make, how do you make sure that, people the same way of like not just thinking, as Didier pointed out, as, oh, it's just a technical thing, but the holistic view. So I'll let you both sort of react to that.
I can just jump in, quickly on this. Yeah, I mean, so we talk about measurement, but measurement is just the flip side of regulation, right? Well, regulation plus what investors are going to demand, and then, the greenwashing, and then making sure there's no greenwashing is kind of how you make sure that the right thing happens, right? So, and the trick is that, so we're trying to set these global norms or whatever kinds of norms. But the reality is that regulation is on a country by country basis, except for you're talking about the EU, where they try to get their act together. But so it's very, very challenging to do this. And you do have to have an understanding of what's going on. Sri Lanka is an incredibly instructive case because, I mean, I think with the kind of the best of intentions, they said, we're going to go totally organic. And so they stopped bringing fertilizer into the country, and suddenly a country that had been a major, food exporter, or, and certainly being able to feed itself, had to suddenly start importing a lot of food. But, and this kind of gets, I think, to the heart of the argument here, which is that governments can't figure it out on their own. And it's the entrepreneurs, I think, and those with the new ideas that they have to really depend upon to get the idea, and then make sure that they're being accompanied on the way, because that's where, the sort of exciting ideas will come from. Now, the government sets the rules of the game. The government knows what it wants to do. It'll regulate, it'll support, it'll finance, but it's not going to be the one to kind of figure things out. And, and so when I look at this, and, when I think about trade-offs, and I think Martine was saying there's no trade, for me, again, I'm a development economist, right? So I'm very worried. I have children. I'm worried about the future. I mean, our planet is going in a direction of self-destruction. But in the meantime, we have a lot of people who are living on less than $2 a day. We have a lot of people, as Didier was mentioning, that are highly undernourished. And yet we have every ability, and plus lots of people without decent jobs, right? So I think what governments can do is basically say, okay, in the list of priorities, and no doubt, like, we have to be doing this while sort of protecting the environment and not destroying more, species and so on and so forth, to say, look, in our country, it's nutrition and it's jobs and whatever, and just, to provide some guidelines. At the end of the day, things will happen the way that they happen, but not to kill it then, right? And again, coming back, it's going to be so important. And that's why I think Kanira, like what you're talking about, is really important in terms of getting people together, making sure that, across the different areas that they're talking to each other. But I would also emphasize the importance of talking to people from other sectors, because again, who would have thought, that energy, well, we know that energy is important, but who would have thought that this could change so quickly, and that'll have an impact on fertilizer, and that suddenly, going back to what Didier was saying, it's so much more attractive suddenly to think about regenerative agriculture. So can we then push that in the right direction? So just exciting things happening so fast, but the reality is that the government's led, the world is led by governments, and we have to do our best within that framework.
Martine, I know you wanted to comment.
Loads of things I'd like to comment on. Yeah, so I very much agree with Jennifer that indeed the governments are the regulatory bodies, but we do need entrepreneurship as well to change the system. At the coalition as well, we try to work with all these different worlds and to bring them together, and also with the UNEP TEEP program. So TEEP, actually, it stands for the economics of ecosystems and biodiversities. We work together with UNEP, and UNEP leads on developing frameworks to look at all of the capitals in each of the countries I mentioned before. And we are responsible for the business engagement, and really we, like Kanira mentioned before, we provide training sessions also to the entrepreneurs on these guidelines, like how does one go through such a methodology, what are the steps you need to take, and we provide some hand-holding as well in terms of not just the measurement, but also the valuation of the impacts and dependencies, and then looking into the application. So for instance, we've worked with a tech food company in Brazil as well, Live Up, and they've done a whole assessment on conventional versus organic food farming, and looked at the benefits organic farming would have, and based on that assessment, they decided to adopt a more organic strategy, and to prioritize that, and also partnership development, and to cut out certain levels in their supply chain. So that can be results of such projects. So I think it's really good to, indeed, we have to work together to come up with solutions, and we need, as I said before, all of the actors, but also different methodologies to support different elements in the sector. And we have a transformation loop as well, where we kind of look into the science-based targets, for instance, are relevant to certain businesses, but maybe not so much for smaller ones. So there are different guidance and different materials for each actor in the loop, I would say.
And I'd love to sort of get maybe Didier, even because I know this is a challenge that I think Aleph has had at times, is some of the existing frameworks, take even the SBTI, sort of require sort of having a baseline, you are, yet, you are at a stage in the company where, you don't have, the baseline. You're not make a lot of these frameworks are about what's your baseline, let's make and then make a commitment to changes that we'll make, and these are incremental changes. And here we've got a lot of companies that are not looking at making incremental changes, they're looking at literally totally disrupting, thinking differently, yet some of these frameworks aren't taking in that into account, and nor are, and we're looking at, for instance, COP20, COP27 coming up. They're very, it's very hard for entrepreneurs to be at the table and be able to share, what these solutions, the type of disruption or, that these solutions can bring. And so that governments can understand where they can be investing, or, what are some of the, as Jennifer pointed out, some of the trade-offs that they need to make, or decisions of where that, what their priorities are in each country. So, do you want to sort of comment on what that's been like for you, Didier?
Yes, definitely. Aleph is the only company in this emerging industry of cultivated meat which committed to net zero targets by 2025, scope 1 and 2, and 2030 scope 3. And we're very much, let's say, relying on two very strong pillars on our visions. In our vision, one is sustainability, and the other one, food security. And it's clear that on the sustainability front, all the science-based targets and most of the programs and governmental support as well, and subsidies, incentives are intended to support companies which are polluting today toward the transition for polluting less, or who are, have some kind of existing benchmark and improving the existing benchmark. And there is no framework globally or even locally to which could support companies such as Aleph and other ones, InFarm and others, which are trying to build the right production systems and the right foundations right at start, meaning building the company net zero at start. And this is a state of mind which the larger organizations and NGOs, but also public entities, are not there yet. It's probably because most of those innovating companies are not visible enough, or not on their radar, and are not necessarily aware of this need. But that's definitely something as a company, and as part of the alliance as well, which we're interested to promote. In principle, we had some discussions about that in the past. We believe that for this transition of the food system to occur, and the innovative companies to play their role in supporting this transition, we really need a much better public-private partnership at the level of the SMEs and the innovators. And that's not only relating to science-based targets, but also more widely in terms of policy making. At Aleph, we're a big supporter of accounting for the true cost of food. We believe that today the barriers for a wider and quicker transition of the food system is that the true cost of the food is not accounted for. And on the opposite, many times in Europe, in the US, we tend to heavily subsidize production methods which are detrimental to the environment. So if we could first shift the incentives, the UK has started doing that a couple of years ago with their 5-year plan toward farming practices which are accounting for the environmental impact, and potentially provide support to innovators such as Aleph Farms, InFarm, or other companies which are offering solutions to supplement this transition toward regenerative agriculture by providing additional production systems. I think it can really help. All the stakeholders de-risking and making this transition. We also need better regulatory frameworks for new food, especially in Europe. The novel food regulatory framework is really the most complicated in the world. Maybe with China, but it can take 2-3 years. It's very political. It's not a science-based assessment of food safety. There's a first science-based assessment, but then we have a political decision to approve or not approve novel foods, which has nothing to do with the safety of the food. It's completely lobbying. So it doesn't make sense. Meaning, if we have a good solution, which is nutritious, which is safe, which the consumers want, so let the innovators sell this food to who would like to buy it. No, it's not like that. So we need to adapt this framework. And I think that last but not least, we also need to make sure that the public sector is sharing the risk of this transition. We were mentioning the energy sector before. I think that the transition toward renewable energies wouldn't have occurred if there had been no tax breaks or off-take agreements or incentives for scaling up those technologies until they reached some type of economies of scale and price parity with the fossil fuel or more polluting type of energy sources. I think that same as with cultivated meat, for instance, our technologies will be relatively expensive at start and will have economies of scale. We need to improve the production process to build on expanding the supply chain to be competitive on a longer term. And here again, we need this public-private partnership and this support from public entities to bridge this gap from inception toward price parity to make it happen. Same with electric vehicles, for instance. The electric vehicles have been very expensive to start with, and there were a lot of tax breaks and support and funding incentives by the governments to drive this transition. And now this incentive is going, to be much lower because they don't need it anymore, and that's fine. We need similar schemes and type of support.
I think what's interesting is that every one of you that I've spoke with and when we were getting ready for the panel really brought up this whole true cost of food aspect. So I know Jennifer, you want to have a comment, and then I also know that Padraic, you also want to comment on what we've just been talking about.
Yeah, so just really, I sat on the UN Food Systems working group on true cost of food. So it's really challenging, and it's yet so important, and it's all about internalizing the externalities, blah, 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 whatever. But I think that something that we have to put out there that's really important is subsidies. Rich world, all subsidies, right? Because the stuff you're talking about, okay, let's subsidize the good stuff. We have a real challenge right now, which is that governments are like subsidizing the bad stuff like crazy, and that's a huge lobby. And Didier, I think that's what you were sort of, alluding to. So I think we need to have some sort of first do no harm principle. And by the way, this isn't only on the wrong kind of agriculture using the wrong kinds of inputs and all that, but it's also about subsidizing rich country farmers to the detriment of, anybody trying to do anything in poorer countries. So, okay, I'll just stop there. But I think we have to talk about that. And by the way, you guys are, sort of an alliance. I'm obsessed. I keep walking around kind of, are you my mommy? Are you trying to find a group that will get together and find a way to convince governments to do the right thing on this? And I don't know who, but if we don't get that, then it's going to be hard to do anything else.
And I think Kanira, maybe just on your impact report, that is one of your key pillars, is the do no harm, philosophy. But Padraic and then Martine, I think you both want to comment.
Yeah, what Didier says is so true, right? We're competing with a industry which is subsidized by governments, but also by future generations, with all of the severe externalities. And the true cost of that production is really, really low. And this has a lot of problems. For example, if InFarm wants to produce staple crops, which we would like to do, that's how we have impact. We can be honest, right now we're producing salads and herbs, that's great. But if we want to really change food systems, we need to move beyond that. But the price of rice or wheat is so far from what its true cost is, it's really hard for us to get into that market. Now, there are ways around that, and we're coming up with them. And we spoke a lot about how to subsidize and how to incentivize. I always think of also a nice example of how policy can lead to innovation, not necessarily through subsidy, but through strong regulation. So in the Netherlands, I think it was in the 80s or in the 90s, there was a large starch industry from potato starch industry. And when you process potatoes to extract starch, one of the remaining supernatants is a protein-rich fraction. And they were just dumping this into the environment, into the watercourse, and that really causes horrific pollution. It really stinks locally, maybe not having a global impact. And locally, people complained and said, this is just not acceptable. They went to the local government and all the way to the national government. And then they implemented a policy which just said, we're banning this. You can't dump this into the environment anymore. So that meant that the companies had to do something with it. So they started R&D, and protein from potatoes is actually a useful protein. You can eat it, you can put it in all sorts of additives. And the situation is now flipped to the point where the more valuable part of the potato crop is no longer the starch, but the protein. And that's only because the industry was forced to innovate by this kind of strict regulation. And I think it's of course a little cartoon example, but thinking about this at a larger scale, when you implement these barriers as a government, you don't always have to incentivize, you don't always have to support in that way. You can just make the practices which are so unsustainable no longer legal, or whatever way you want to implement that. And that forces that innovation. And I think that's one of the things I think we really need to see more of. And going back to some of the discussions earlier, like you mentioned Sri Lanka, and we talked about regenerative agriculture, and also some of the people that you invest in, for example, moving to organic. For me, like the European framework and Farm Fork framework, moving towards organic was a big mistake, because it's not looking at the bigger picture. And I think it's one of the cases where the lobbying has really had a negative impact, because yes, maybe for each apple, like it's a little bit more sustainable, but you need so much more space. And that's what we really need to look at. How can we reduce that overall impact? And what Didier said was really nice. If we in the tech can provide the ability to produce like large quantities so that what agriculture remains is more sustainable and is regenerative, that would be great. But no agricultural field is ever going to be as good as a natural ecosystem in terms of providing ecosystem services and biodiversity restoration. And we forget that when we compare two agricultural systems, we're forgetting there's a third thing out there, which is nature. And that's the one that we really need to provide space for.
Martine, I think you.
Thank you. So many interesting things. I guess I'd like to bring a bit of good news in terms of the externalities. And I think often in these panels, it's been said like we need to do this more, or we need this and that. I've been talking about the Toubia Agri-Food guidelines quite a bit, but I know that the framing here has been the true cost accounting. And actually the guidelines that we drafted is a step-by-step approach for businesses to look at true cost accounting. So there are things already out there for businesses to make this more useful and practical and applicable. So that's the first bit of good news I wanted to give you, because a lot of this true cost accounting is actually based on the TEEP framework, but that's maybe more of an historical question, and also the capitals approach. And secondly, I normally like to talk more about true value of food rather than true cost, because I think it's important for businesses that they, it's not, if we also think about society, right? If we just talk about true price and externalities, consumers think that they are the ones that need to pay more. Whereas a lot of this is about making businesses understand where their impacts and dependencies are, so that they make better decisions and actually have better supply chains and better management of their decisions. So it's also about valuation and shifting the way that business is being done. So not just the costing, but it's really a systematic way of shifting decisions. And thirdly, there was a lot of talk about the private and public space and integration. And I guess Jennifer is also aware of the TCA, the True Cost Accounting Accelerator, which is also a body where we've been talking a lot about public-private sector integration and how to combine efforts. And so there is already a group working on this quite effectively, I would say. And also last week, actually led by FAO, we've been having a 5-day conversation about the state of the food and agriculture report, SOFA report for 2023, with the True Cost of Food for Sustainable and Healthy Diets that will be coming out early next year. So really also speaking to policy and also the practical side on how businesses and policymakers can look into these important issues.
So I have a question for Kanira and Didier, and I think Kanira, actually, I think you want to comment, but my question is more, you know, Kanira, with your portfolio companies, and maybe Didier, from your perspective, when you launched the company, were you aware of all these different organization frameworks, you know, that we're discussing today, you know, they have, you know, or were you just sort of like, I have a product, I'm trying to, you know, solve a specific solution? And so are we also even here with all these different, you know, discussing, you know, private-public partnerships and different things? There's still, in my view, a gap between the entrepreneurs and this world that we're even talking about today of, you know, how to move forward and how to think through. So big question is, you know, how can we today make sure that the entrepreneurs, without the complexity of the existing organizations, how can we help them at least have a, you know, a holistic approach and sort of guide them in an easier way in the beginning and not weigh them down with this, like, how do I even navigate this world? Didier, Kanira?
Didier,
Kanira,
go for
please.
it. Keen to know how we can be better. So.
I think it's a very good point that a lot of small startups don't necessarily have the resources to allocate, you know, to really take part in think tanks and reflection groups and to attend. For instance, we've been very active at the Food System Summit, and we published a white paper in the framework of the pre-summit in Rome last year. We actually hired a team to really work on those topics. You know, Lee Recht, well, we have today 2 people working full-time only on measuring our impact and making sure that we understand the ecosystem in which we evolve to optimize the outcome of what we do on the system-based. I think that the limitation is primarily the resources. I mean, it might be a little bit of awareness. Again, I think that a lot of entrepreneurs are looking at what they do as a technical issue to solve, and we need maybe to change the mindset a little bit. But the other, and I think the mindset is changing, by the way. A lot of entrepreneurs are more and more motivated by the impact their innovation might deliver to the world, and are driven by impact and by purpose much earlier on. So that's changing. So I believe the real issue is resources. And here, you know, teaming up with other young companies, same as in the framework of the GATT Alliance, or taking part in specific programs. For instance, we were active at the World Economic Forum for a few years already, and we were part of the Tech Pioneers program, and today the Global Innovators program. And there are some frameworks at FAO, and we're part of the private sector mechanism at the FAO, for instance, which is a framework for the FAO to get some input from the private sector as part of their policy-making efforts. So there are some frameworks startups or younger companies can really integrate to make their voice heard. And that's what we're trying to do. But it's easier to do it as a group, as few startups together, so that we can pool resources and coordinate between us. And we need to allocate resources.
And just quickly to add to that, with as investors, especially early stage investors, right, we're there to help young companies to set them on their track. And we actually believe that a lot of the impact in the end will actually happen after an exit. That's where companies really, you know, have that growth, like what you were saying about InFarm, right? Like when you really do those volumes, that's where the real impact comes, and we're just there to help you in that early stage. And it's also what we've incorporated now to think about, okay, after exit, what happens, and how can that be sort of discounted for in our thinking. But yeah, we're there to help you along the way and see what options you're potentially missing, and create that dialogue together.
I think it's a great point, because when we're talking about startups, the investors have a great role, and that's also, if we might give an advice to entrepreneurs, to get the right investors on board and see them as partners for building the company and driving the category, and not just as a source of money. At Aleph, we've been very strict and very picky with investors we've had on board. And we see sometimes companies trying just to maximize the valuation and raising as much as they can on the highest price possible from anyone willing to write a check at this price, which in our views is not the right way to build a solid foundation for the company to deliver its targets.
So I know we just have a few minutes left. I'd love to and maybe, you know, get, and again, more from the company's side. So both InFarm, Aleph, like how are you making sure, as you know, or how do you see within the organization, everybody keeping an impact being part of every decision-making process, and not falling into traditional, you know, old ways of thinking where you're just, you know, having to make a decision based on, you know, cost or, you know, things like that, and how within, you know, and again, maybe, you know, InFarm, it'd be interesting, you know, you're on the research side, and when you're doing research and looking at, you know, are you talking to the teams that are looking at, you know, facilities and things like that, and what the implications are of your, you know, if we go down, you know, the cross implications of really scaling some of the solutions you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So I guess one of the big components is data, is understanding really how what you're doing translates in the real world. And we're very lucky in InFarm because we have an impact division, Chief Impact Officer Suds, and he has a team of people helping us understand how we're performing. One of the other things that's very nice, especially speaking from the R&D side, you know, one of the things we have to do is to be improve our profitability. And one of the ways of improving profitability is to improve efficiencies. And there's this synergism between those efficiencies and at all levels, resource use, energy use, fertilizer use, and everything, and having a positive impact. So there's this alignment actually between our goals, both at a business side and a sustainability side. And I cannot right now think of any situations where those misalign, but sometimes they do. And then of course it's that comes down to a decision-making process about where and how much freedom do we have to push in one direction or another. But if you try to set things up right, you can align those things. And that, of course, is allows for a self-perpetuating system towards sustainability. And it's all about setting up systems to try and make that happen.
Didier, for you, how do you sort of get the entire organization to?
Yes, actually, I see it slightly differently. I mean, we hear a lot about sustainability being aligned with business and being viewed as a way to improve profitability, and that's fine. But the issue that what we've seen in the last year, for instance, you know, when sustainability and economics do not fit one with the other anymore, economics get you know, the higher stance over sustainability. So I think that if we're looking at sustainability just as a way to serve economics, once it does not serve economics, so it's not a priority anymore. So it's always a sensitive balance. I believe we should have sustainability goals as independent goals and business goals as independent goals, and not necessarily connecting the, you know, one serving the other one. And I completely agree with Padraic that the key is really to measure, because, you know, the issue with the sustainability is that, you know, many times when we need to make decisions on day-to-day basis, we're under a lot of pressure to reach our milestones as a startup and to deliver projects and to meet our targets. And sustainability is a more abstract thing, which many times, you know, is not necessarily what's leading the day-to-day decision, just because it's more abstract when we have clear quantitative targets. So turning sustainability into clear quantitative targets and reporting on sustainability, measuring our impact as we do every 6 months, 18 parameters, is really the way to monitor and to make sure that sustainability incorporates the metrics and the quantitative targets we have as a company, and not just having a vision, but having a clear quantitative targets.
So
I would just like to add to that, in the situations where sustainability and business don't align, right, that's a real problem. And where I think the industry or governments could really help is in policies which help that discrepancy. So like with the pollution via the protein or from the potatoes or something like that, if you have policies which make it no longer profitable to be non-sustainable, well, that really helps with the whole business of moving towards sustainability, because the risk is always that if you take the sustainable path and it's less profitable, somebody will come along and undercut you, and then you're no longer viable. And if you're no longer viable, you're no longer going to be able to have the impact you want to have. And that's why I think regulation is really key to this industry being able to have impact. Without that kind of regulatory support, we won't make it.
So I know we're at the top of the hour, and but one of the things that I think is challenging, and it comes out on at least for me in this conversation, how to exactly measure in a way that we can compare different organizations, and is a real challenge. And there isn't one specific framework, and it also depends on, the specific sector, the specific, where you are in your lifestyle, company lifestyle and things like that. But, just to close off, anybody have sort of last comments that, like to share, or reactions to sort of the topics that we've had today about, how do you help entrepreneurs and this, again, and going back to, a comment you made earlier, Padraic, it's like, how do you make the agri-food tech sector, responsible, for its actions, so that it doesn't, we don't end up in a situation where, we have all these claims about being able to have all this impact, and at the end of the day, there'll be some companies that do succeed and others that are just greenwashing.
Can I step in, or?
Go for it, and then we'll. Yeah.
So just conclude, I think the make it mandatory hashtag is open until the 18th of October. So there seems to be an understanding that that's really needed to have regulation to urge businesses to do this. So I would urge everybody to go there. And secondly, we do have quite a lot of guidance on what is in place for several actors in the field. So have a look, and always welcome to support. We're an NGO, so we don't have any. And lastly, one comment I wanted to make, I think sustainability isn't abstract. It's really vital for any business. And if you look at natural capital, especially in the food sector, we all depend on that. So I think it needs to be incorporated in the decision making.
Kanira, did you have something you wanted to?
Oh, good. I think that's a great way to
end. Well, thank you all very much for joining today's discussion, and hopefully we will have fewer and fewer of these discussions, because we'll have finally come up with ways of measuring and showing our impact. So thank you very much.
Thank you.